Do you remember the dinners that used to sit on the Australian table every single week? The ones that came out of whatever was cheap, whatever was left over, and whatever a tired cook could put together after a long day? These were not restaurant meals. They were not trendy meals. They were working meals, fed a family, and never once asked for a compliment. Somewhere along the way, we stopped making them. We stopped teaching them, and we stopped talking about them altogether. So today, we are bringing them back. 10 dinners that once belonged to every working Australian household and somehow vanished without a word. Let us count them down. Number 10 is oxtail stew. Most people today would walk straight past oxtail at a butcher without giving it a second look. That is actually how it ended up on so many working-class tables to begin with. The wealthier families did not want it. Too many bones, too much effort, too much time standing over a pot before you got anything worth eating. So butchers sold it cheap, and working families bought it up without hesitation. You would take those segments of tail, season them with salt and pepper, and brown them off in a heavy pot first. Then in went the onion, the carrot, the celery, a couple of bay leaves, a cup of dark beer or whatever red wine was left in the bottle. You covered the whole thing with water and let it go low and slow on the stove for 4 or 5 hours. What happened during those hours was something special. The collagen in the bones broke down completely and turned the liquid into a dark, glossy gravy that thickened all on its own. No corn flour needed, no tricks required. The meat fell away from the bone in soft, generous pieces, and the whole pot tasted like it had been worked on all week. You served it over mashed potato or with a thick slice of bread, and that was Saturday sorted. Today, oxtail appears on restaurant menus at $50 a serve. Back then, it was the cheap cut nobody wanted, and somehow it was the best thing on the table. Number 9 is tripe and onions. Say the word tripe today and watch what happens at a dinner table. People pull faces. Someone makes a joke. Most people quietly move the conversation along. But 60 or 70 years ago, tripe and onions was a completely normal Tuesday night dinner in working Australian homes. Nobody flinched. Nobody complained. You ate it and you were glad to have it. Tripe is the stomach lining of a cow or sheep. It comes white and firm with a honeycomb texture and a mild flavor that responds extremely well to long, slow cooking. The old way of making it was to simmer it in milk rather than water. You would add sliced onions, a couple of bay leaves, some white pepper, and let the whole thing cook very gently for a long time. The milk pulled out any harshness and left behind a creamy, thick sauce with soft onions throughout. You ladled it over mashed potato and served it hot. It was filling, it was cheap, and it was made from a part of the animal that would have otherwise gone to waste. Butchers sold it for almost nothing. That made it perfect for families, where every penny of the grocery budget was already accounted for. Today, you would struggle to find it on any menu in the country outside of a handful of old-school RSL clubs. It faded away quietly as Australia got wealthier and people stopped buying the cuts nobody wanted. But for a long time, it was honest, dependable food, simple to make and simple to eat. Number 8 is rabbit stew. There is a reason rabbit stew appears in almost every story about Australian families during the Great Depression. It was free. Wild rabbits were everywhere across the country at that time, living in plague numbers across farmland from Queensland down to Victoria. A man with a trap or a rifle could come back from an hour outside with enough meat to feed his whole family. You would skin the rabbit, joint it into pieces, and drop it into a pot with whatever vegetables you had growing out the back. Potatoes, carrots, onion, maybe a sprig of rosemary. You covered it with water, added a pinch of salt, and let it sit on a low heat for the better part of an afternoon. Rabbit meat is lean and mild and slightly sweet. It falls off the bone when it is cooked long enough, and the broth it makes is light but flavorful. A piece of bread on the side and the meal was complete. Families ate this through the 30s and well into the post-war years. It cost nothing, and it kept people fed when there was no money for anything else. There was no embarrassment around that table. You were eating what the land provided, and that was enough. Today, rabbit is considered a specialty item. You see it at farmers markets and on bistro menus at a significant price. The pot on the stove that fed Australian families through the hardest years this country has ever seen is long gone. But it did the job when nothing else could. Number 7 is curried sausages. Curried sausages were everywhere in Australian kitchens, from the 1950s right through to the 1990s, and then almost overnight they disappeared from the regular dinner rotation. That is a real shame because they were genuinely good. The dish came together simply. You fried the sausages first, either whole or sliced into thick rounds, and set them aside. Then you built the sauce in the same pan. Onion and garlic went in first, then a tablespoon or two of curry powder stirred through until the kitchen filled with that warm, sharp smell. In went a tin of diced tomatoes or a cup of chicken stock, sometimes both, and a spoon of fruit chutney from the pantry shelf. You added the sausages back in, and let everything simmer together for about 20 minutes so the sausages soaked up the curry sauce and the sauce picked up the fat from the sausages. You served it over white rice or with a thick piece of bread to scoop it up with. The whole family could be fed for next to nothing. It was one of those meals that filled the kitchen with a smell so good that kids would come in from the backyard without being called. Curry powder was one of the first exotic ingredients that found its way into ordinary Australian kitchens after the war. Working families took it and made something entirely their own with it. Practical, warming, and deeply satisfying. Today, it barely gets a mention. But for about 4 decades, it was a Friday night staple at tables all around the country. Number 6 is mince on toast. Mince on toast gets dismissed a lot. People call it simple. They call it the meal you made when nothing else was available. They are missing the point entirely. When it was made properly, it was one of the most satisfying things you could put on a plate on a weeknight. You started by browning minced beef well in a hot pan. Not just warming it through, but actually getting real color on it, which is where the flavor came from. Then in went a finely diced onion, cooked until soft and slightly sweet. A spoon of flour stirred through to thicken it up. A good pour of beef stock, or even just hot water. A splash of Worcestershire sauce, which was the ingredient that made the whole thing taste like something, sometimes a tin of tomatoes if you had one. It simmered down in about 15 minutes into a rich, meaty gravy, and you spooned it generously. Over thick slices of white toast, while the toast was still hot enough to hold it. The whole dish cost almost nothing to make. It took no real skill. It required no special ingredients, but it turned up on the plate, warm and filling and tasting like genuine effort. That was the thing about dinners like this one. The people making them were working with almost nothing and still putting real care into every pan. You could taste that care in every bite. Today we have meal kits and recipe apps and still somehow manage to not cook on weeknights. Back then, mince on toast was on the table in 20 minutes and everyone went to bed full. Number 5 is pea and ham soup. Pea and ham soup made from a real smoked ham hock is one of the great forgotten meals of the Australian working household. Not the stuff from a tin, the real thing. You started it in the morning and ate it at night. The ham hock went into a large pot of cold water and came very slowly to a simmer. It cooked low for a couple of hours, and the water around it turned a rich golden color and picked up all the smokiness from the meat. Then in went a bag of dried green split peas that had been soaking since the night before, along with a diced onion and a couple of carrots. You kept it on a low heat, and the split peas slowly broke down and dissolved into the broth until the soup thickened itself up from the inside. No blending required. No thickener needed. By the time you lifted the hock out and pulled the soft meat off the bone and stirred it back in, you had a soup so thick and rich it was almost a meal in 2 courses by itself. You ate it with buttered bread and nothing else was needed. Working men used to take it to the job in a thermos. It was warm, it was filling, it was cheap to make, and it lasted 2 days on the stove. The split peas cost almost nothing. The ham hock was one of the cheaper cuts at any butcher. The flavor that came out of both of them together was something far beyond the price you paid. You can still buy it in a tin today. It is not the same thing. Number 4 is corned silverside with white sauce. Monday night in an old Australian household had a very specific smell. You would notice it from the driveway before you even opened the back door. The deep, slightly sweet, salty smell of a piece of corned silverside simmering slowly in a big pot on the stove. Silverside was beef that had been cured in a salt brine and then sold as a cheap weekly roast option for working families. You dropped it in a pot of cold water, brought it up slowly to a simmer, and left it there for about 3 hours. While it cooked, you added your vegetables to the same pot: carrots, potatoes, onion, sometimes a small wedge of cabbage. They cooked in the liquid alongside the beef and picked up all of that salt and savoriness. When the silver side was done, you sliced it thickly and served it with those vegetables and poured a homemade white sauce over the top of everything. The white sauce was just butter, flour, and milk cooked together with a little pepper and a pinch of nutmeg. Simple as that. But it pulled the whole plate together and made what was essentially boiled meat and vegetables feel like a proper dinner. The piece of silver side was cheap enough that it could feed a family of 6 and still leave enough slices for sandwiches the next day. 2 meals from 1 cut of meat, that was the kind of thinking that ran every working household in the country. Today, you rarely see silver side cooked this way in a home kitchen. But for decades, it was the meal that started the week. Number 3 is lambs, fry, and bacon. Lamb's fry is a dish that divides people immediately, and that has always been part of its identity. You either grew up on it and feel something settle in your chest when you hear the name, or you have never had it, and you have strong feelings about that too. For the people who grew up on it, nothing needs explaining. For everyone else, here is the thing. Lamb's fry is lamb liver, sliced thin, dusted lightly in flour, and fried in a hot pan with a good amount of fat until just cooked through. Not overdone, because that is where liver gets its bad reputation. Just cooked through so it stays tender and mild. Then thick rashers of bacon went into the same pan and fried alongside it. The two things sharing a pan and sharing their flavor, fried onions came last, cooked slow and golden in all the combined fat until they were soft and sweet and poured over the top of everything like a rough, honest sauce. The whole dish was on the table in under 20 minutes. It was cheap because offal was cheap. Butchers practically gave it away compared to proper cuts. But it was packed with iron and protein and flavor that punched well above its price. It went off menus and off tables when prosperity came in and people stopped buying offal altogether. The generation that grew up on lamb's fry still talks about it, and most of them will tell you honestly that they miss it. Cheap, fast, nourishing, and completely its own thing. That was lamb's fry. Number 2 is chops and 3 veg. If you grew up in an Australian home between the 1950s and the 1980s and you ask anyone in the family what dinner looked like on a Tuesday night, the answer is almost always the same: chops and 3 veg. It was the meal that defined an era of Australian family life more than any other. You took lamb loin chops or fork quarter chops, the cheap bone-in cuts, and you put them under a hot grill or into a heavy pan with a little fat. You cooked them until the outside had a proper browned crust and the inside was still slightly pink at the bone. Then you boiled your 3 vegetables. Potato cut into chunks and boiled until floury and soft inside. Carrots cut into rounds and cooked until just tender. Peas, either from the garden or from a tin, heated through and bright green. You put it all on a plate together with the chops and sometimes a squirt of tomato sauce from the bottle on the side. That was it. No garnish, no fancy plating, no sauce that took half an hour to prepare. Just good lamb and honest vegetables on a plate in front of a hungry family. Lamb was always good because Australian lamb is genuinely good. It has its own flavor and it does not need anything complicated done to it. The vegetables were real vegetables bought loose at the market, not frozen, not pre-cut, not pre-washed in a plastic bag. The whole meal cost very little and delivered exactly what was needed at the end of a working day. Simple, reliable, and completely Australian. We stopped making it when the food world told us simple was not good enough. That was our mistake. Number 1 is bread and dripping. Most people under the age of 40 have no idea what dripping is. That is worth a moment of thought on its own. Dripping was the fat that collected at the bottom of the roasting pan when you cooked a piece of beef or lamb or pork. After the roast came out, you poured that liquid fat carefully through a strainer into a tin or a bowl and let it cool down and set. It became a pale, creamy, deeply savory spread with a layer of dark meat juices at the bottom and a firm cap of white fat on top. It cost nothing because it was already there. It was a byproduct of something you had already cooked. Working families from the Depression years and through both worlds, wars kept a dripping tin on the back of the stove as a matter of course, when there was not much else in the house. When money had run out before the week had, you cut a thick piece of bread and spread that dripping on it like butter, generously, not thinly. Then you hit it with a good crack of salt, and that was your meal. It sounds like it should not be satisfying, But fat and salt on bread is one of the oldest and most deeply comforting combinations in the history of human eating. Workers took it to the job site in brown paper parcels. Kids ate it after school without complaint. The tin on the back of the stove was refilled every time a roast went in the oven, and it was never wasted. Today, we tip the roasting fat down the drain without thinking. Back then, it was the backup when everything else ran out. Simple, honest, and quietly essential. That was bread and dripping. 10 dinners, 10 stories, from a time when a working family fed itself on almost nothing and still made it feel like a real meal every single night. These dishes did not come from cookbooks. They came from knowing your pantry, knowing your budget, and knowing how to make the most of everything you had. If one of these brought back a memory for you, or a smell, or a face at a table you have not thought about in a while, leave it in the comments below. Tell us which one you remember.